All right, looks like we're holding steady at 20. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce our speakers. First off, thank you everyone for being here this evening. We're going to be having a discussion of some of the central tenets of critical race theory. So our three panelists tonight are Dr. Stacey Davis, Dr. Dan Horan, and Dr. Kelly Faust. Dr. Davis teaches courses on religious conversion, Christian anti-Judaism, and the Hebrew Bible. Her research areas are rhetorical criticism, feminist biblical interpretation, and African American biblical interpretation. She first learned racism was permanent at 7 and has been working to keep calm and carry on ever since. Dr. Horan is a professor of philosophy, religious studies, and theology, and he's our new director of the Center for Spirituality here at St. Mary's College. A columnist for the National Catholic Reporter, he is the author of 14 books, including most recently, A White Catholic's Guide to Racism and Privilege, and The Way of the Franciscans, A Prayer Journey Through Lent. Our third speaker, Dr. Faust, is a professor of sociology and criminology here at St. Mary's. She regularly teaches introductory classes in sociology and criminology, as well as criminology electives such as juvenile delinquency, gender and law, police courts and corrections, and the comparative criminology. She has published research on the flooding resulting from Hurricane Katrina as a state crime of omission. So what we're going to do this evening is I'm going to yield the stage, so to speak, to Dr. Davis. From Dr. Davis's talk, we're going to go into Dr. Horan's talk, and then into Dr. Faust's talk, and then we'll do a collective Q&A at the end of the session. Dr. Davis, go ahead and take it away.
All right, thank you. Share screen here. All right, well, thank you all for coming this evening. 2 days ago, the former US president informed a rally in South Carolina that people should be willing to die in the fight against critical race theory, in the fight against what he claimed was an argument that, quote, America is a racist nation, end quote. The tenet that I picked was the permanence of racism, which appears to some extent to be motivating some of the hostility towards critical race theory. And so what does it mean to say that racism is permanent? I'm quoting from the American Bar Association. It is an acknowledgement that racism is a normal feature of society and embedded within systems and institutions, like the legal systems that replicate racial inequality. This dismisses the idea that racist incidents are aberrations, but instead are manifestations of structural and systemic racism, end quote. In other words, to say that racism is permanent is to argue that there aren't really bad actors, that you're not criticizing individual racists, that structures in this country and in some other countries, but we'll focus on the US for tonight, were effectively built to include inequality in that structure. And so what I'm going to argue tonight briefly is that to argue for the permanence of racism is to argue the opposite of a phrase that we hear constantly whenever something bad happens. And it's, this is not who we are. With apologies for the 10-second ad that you will have to endure first.
Let me be very clear. The scenes of chaos at the Capitol do not reflect a true America, do not represent who we are.
Are you sure about that, Joe? An armed standoff? White male entitlement? Conspiracy theories? Sounds pretty American to me. Just look at this guy.
This is not who we are as a nation.
This is not who we are as a country.
It's not who we are. We're better than this.
We may be shocked by pictures of a mob invading the Capitol, but check out the paintings hanging behind them in the rotunda. We shouldn't be surprised because we've always been like this. America is a nation built on stolen land by stolen people. And if Wednesday's rampage feels historic, it's because violence is in our national DNA. A mob raised a whole block in Philadelphia because they didn't like, you guessed it, the election result.
Sorry, I'm having a little trouble here. There we go. And so a number of folks have used Twitter to argue against this concept of "this is not who we are." That phrase gets used to describe whatever makes people uncomfortable without realizing that historically, this is to some extent what America has always been. And so we're going to do sort of a little series of exercises here. Just ask the Native Americans. The shirt that hopefully you all can see says Homeland Security, fighting terrorism since 1492, and has Native Americans holding guns. I bought this shirt from my father many, many years ago because I'm from Oklahoma, so it made sense. And when I went to Google it to see if I could get a picture of it, the first one that popped up was the shirt that is now at the British Museum. Even the British Museum knows that this is kind of who we are. Okay. Just ask our own college. Land acknowledgements, which are becoming very popular these days, are a way of stating, yes, all of us are effectively on land that was stolen from some people who were minding their own business. And while we're not necessarily going to give your land back, we acknowledge that it used to be yours and thanks. But there's no real, how should I put this? Nobody, with the possible exception of some churches in Washington state, are actually giving the land back. Okay, we're just saying that we're on it and we're sorry this happened to you. So this is who we are. Asian Americans. The Chinese Exclusion Act, which was passed in the 1880s, was a way of telling Asian Americans, and particularly Chinese Americans, thank you for coming over to our country, all of you Chinese men, and building our railroads. And now we don't ever want to see you or anyone who looks like you ever again. And so it took decades for Asian Americans to even be allowed to return to the US to emigrate like other ethnic groups. And unfortunately, due to COVID-19, anti-Asian violence has continued to spike in the US due to folks calling COVID-19 something that they shouldn't have called it. Just ask Latino or Latina Americans. The image that you see on the screen is basically a picture of the Alamo from the 18th century. And while if you ever go to Texas, the Alamo is portrayed as this great sign of American ingenuity and persistence and grit, the reality is the Mexican government had allowed Americans to stay on that land, minding their own business. And it was the Americans who decided, Mexico really doesn't need Texas. We'll just fight and take it. So again, this is exactly who we are. And in light of the continued questions about identity, about migration, this continues to be a problem.
Why are you the only man who wants to stay?
With apologies for the other ad.
I thought getting rid of all college debt was a good idea.
It's a great idea. It is, even though I never went to college and don't care.
And you know how someone replied?
With a question about how paying for the educations of millions would affect our economy.
Nope. They replied, go back to your country. I'm afraid of things that I don't know. Go back to your country. Go back to Mexico. I replied, hey, that's racist. Plus, I'm Cuban. And they replied, actually calling me racist is racist, when we all know that's not a thing.
And then last but not least, you can ask African Americans about this is who we are. But I point out that initially, Africans weren't Americans. The 3/5 clause made it very clear in the Constitution that my ancestors, I come from slaves on both sides, were to be counted as 60% of a white person, but only for the purposes of basic House of Representatives representation. Black people did not become actual citizens until the 14th Amendment, until after the Civil War. And so for the first 200 and some odd years, people who looked like me were literally property. Okay, so we became Americans thanks to the 14th Amendment, but we're still kind of waiting on that amendment. I just listed 5 things that indicate that perhaps our structures are not yet equal. Police brutality, which I think Dr. Faust is going to talk about a little bit, prison industrial complex, redlining, educational inequities, the fact that Black women are more likely to die in childbirth than other ethnic groups. And so by way of conclusion, if the former president says that people should be willing to fight to the death to avoid dealing with critical race theory, I'm going to give 3 reasons why acknowledging the permanence of racism is not a bad thing. For PGMs, or people from the global majority, it means we can stop feeling like we're being gaslighted. Because every time someone says this is not who we are, folks who are Black and brown can give a laundry list of reasons that this is exactly who we are. And it doesn't mean that individual people are responsible for structures, but it's not necessarily helpful when those same individual people try to tell you that these structures are not there. So that's point 1. Point 2 is it allows us to look at history as it was and not as we hoped it would be. The United States has always been an experiment. There's always been tension between the Declaration of Independence's claim that all men are created equal, and what did it mean to be a man? Because for a while there, it was literally white property owning men. And what did it mean to be equal? This is not a bad thing. The world is never static. And so for the last, I'd say 200 some odd years, this country has been still trying to figure out who it wants to be. We remain a work in progress. We did not come into this world fully formed from God. And last but not least, it allows those of us who choose to fight to keep fighting for the day when this is not who we are actually is true. The cliche about those who do not learn from history being condemned to repeat it is absolutely true. I study racist rhetoric from the 19th century. That's one of my research areas. And what is both amusing and tragic to me is that while the medium changes, the language doesn't. The same arguments about who gets to be human that I read about from the 1830s are the same arguments that I can hear on social media when my partner will not get Facebook off the TV in 2022. The permanence of racism simply means that we as a country were built on a design flaw. We were built on stolen land and the idea that other humans are property. And unless and until we recognize that those flawed structures still affect how the country functions today, my fear is that this is going to be who we are for a very long time. Thank you.
Great, I think it's my turn, so I will share my screen now. The tenet that I've been asked to talk about is whiteness as property. And it's a concept that in many ways is intuitive, ought to be intuitive, but also significantly innovative, something that was articulated with great clarity in 1993 in a now famous Harvard Law Review article by Professor Cheryl Harris. I'll say more about that as we go. But the basic concept is the notion that whiteness itself, whiteness as a property, is understood as having value for its possessor and conveys a host of privileges and benefits to those who are identified in a systemically racist society and white supremacist society such as ours. This is something that is identified with the person themselves. Professor Harris herself explains that whiteness defined the legal status of a person as slave or free. Professor Davis made reference to the constitutional allocation of those of African descent for the purpose of census building and for the purpose of financial allocation across the republic and across states. But what we have here is the question of what constitutes those who are looped into or kind of lumped into that category of not fully human, and those who are given the courtesy, given the privilege, given the dignity of full human status. And what Harris is pointing out is that legally speaking, historically speaking in the US, and again, limiting my remarks tonight to the United States, that whiteness is that distinguishing characteristic. She goes on to say that white identity conferred tangible and economically valuable benefits, and it was jealously guarded as a valued possession. It was allowed only to those who met a strict standard of proof. Whiteness, the right to white identity as embraced by the law, is property in a true sense. If by property one means all of a person's legal rights. And again, we can make reference back to the 14th Amendment, as well as our 400 plus year history of chattel slavery, the legal instantiation of discrimination, and legalized segregation, and so on, up through the present. And I think the 5 examples that Dr. Davis highlighted are great illustrations of how that continues to be manifest. And one last additional quote I want to highlight here before moving onward, to just offer a few reflections about how this functions, and to share a little bit maybe of my own experience as somebody who's identified as white in this context, is to draw from the historian Nell Irvin Painter. When thinking about race in general, whatever racialized identity that we consider, whether blackness, whiteness, and so forth, she makes the point, and really pointedly, that race is an idea, not a fact. Constructions of whiteness have changed over time, shifting to accommodate the demands of social change. Before the mid-19th century, the existence of more than one white race was commonly accepted in popular culture and scholarship. And why this is especially significant is to trouble understandings of whiteness or other racialized identities as absolutely static on the one hand, and having any sense of a sort of biological or genetic or DNA-based sort of legitimacy. In other words, racial identities and race as such is a social construction, and it's fluid. It has meaning depending on the context, the time, interpretation, and culture. That's significant in part because of Harris's work in coming to this conclusion, coming to this argument that I believe to be very compelling and true about the property value of whiteness in the US context. And she uses a Supreme Court case that may be very familiar to all of us, though I can't help but kind of offer a tangent that this is exactly the kind of education in our elementary schools and high schools that so many legislators, including in our own state here of Indiana, are seeking to eradicate. I think most of us who were in elementary and high school before, maybe the last 20 years, at least know the name Plessy versus Ferguson. And even if we don't remember the details, in brief, the details were that a man who was, as was argued, genetically or hereditarily, Mr. Plessy in this case, was 7/8 white. And his claim was that because he could pass as white, be identified as white, that he had a certain entitlement or right to, in a legally segregated railway car, to be in the whites only car. This was contested on the grounds that 1/8 of his racialized identity was Black, and therefore you may have heard this expression before too, about the one drop of Black blood being the determining factor, right? And again, you can see the deeply racist purity presumptions about what constitutes, quote, legitimate whiteness. The Supreme Court argued basically in effect that Plessy did not have a constitutional right to be identified as white, despite again looking at his sort of genealogical lineage, a overwhelming identity or identifying characteristic that could be constituted as white. Why is that significant? Well, it's significant because in Harris's arguing, this is one of the kind of key legal moments that instantiates whiteness as a property in the legal and traditional sense. And it was a property that was withheld from Plessy, one that was not afforded to him. which raises for us this question, what do we mean when we talk about property? Oftentimes, and Dr. Davis just mentioned too, the Constitution. I think it's funny too, as a male religious in the Catholic Church, I legally, technically do not own any property. It's part of the vow formula that I take. And so I hadn't thought about it until, she phrased this here. I'm like, I guess I'm one of the rare exceptions. I do occupy a lot of intersecting privileges. Propertied whiteness is not one of them. Whiteness in maleness, cisgendered maleness certainly is. And so, but that's something to think about. But what does it mean to be propertied? What does it mean to have the legal right to have property? Well, first we have to ask this question, well, what constitutes property? And there are a lot of things that easily come to mind. Land is probably the most obvious and the first thing that comes to mind. Constitutionally, that was the most significant and in many ways remains most significant, right? What is it? I defer to Dr. Faust, but what is it said in criminal justice context? Possession is so many percentages of the law or something like that. Property is key. But we think of other material possessions, vehicles, or laptop computers, like we're all sitting in front of, and that sort of thing. We might think of currency or valuable minerals, jewels, that sort of thing. But there are other forms of legally recognized property that are not necessarily material in the same sense that we might be kind of inclined to think about. So in more recent kind of eras, in the modern era, properties such as air rights are things that have been identified. So if you think of really dense metropolitan areas like downtown Chicago or Manhattan, who has the right to the space above the footprint of the land as it stands, right? That's something that's been recognized as a property. We recognize obviously intellectual property, patents, trademarks, the right to our own work, right? That's why plagiarism is a problem. That's where, theft in that form is also a problem. I think of the cases in the late 90s and early aughts of the Napster trials, right? What constitutes property? Is it a material thing when you have a digital file? How does this work? Cheryl Harris argues, of course, that whiteness functions in our society and legally as a form of property analogous to intellectual property or material property, or something like air rights in real estate law. So how does it function as property? Well, in the legal system here in the United States, there are four ways that we can think about property functioning in traditional senses, and how whiteness fits into that is quite interesting. The first, she argues, is the right of disposition, which means the ability to alienate our property. This is the difference between a crime and a legal transaction. If I own a certain item, let's say a car, a material object, if it's mine, it's my property, I have a right to sell it. Or in some instances, as the US legal system points out, I have the right to abandon some properties, right? That's one of the characteristics of property. This becomes a problem, though, when you start thinking about whiteness, and legal scholars have objected too. Like, well, what does that mean to say that whiteness, my ability to be identified as white and Mr. Plessy's ability to not be identified as white in the 19th century, how does that function in this case? And what legal scholars would point out is that there is, in our history of jurisprudence in the US, plenty of case law that demonstrates that there are inalienable properties, things that cannot be disposed of or abandoned, right? Whiteness is one of those things. I can't abandon my identity as somebody who is white, who occupies a white space and identity. Notwithstanding some of the more recent controversies about folks who pass, the John Howard Griffins of the world temporarily, or the NAACP representative in Spokane, Washington, et cetera, et cetera. That's maybe too much of a tangent here, but bracketing that for a moment, there are other identifiable inalienable properties. So one of the things that case law presents is college and advanced degrees are inalienable, non-disposable, unabandonable properties. Once you earn them, especially wonderful degrees like bachelor's degrees from St. Mary's College, for instance, you can't pass that off to somebody else. They're non-transferable. You can't abandon them. You can't alienate yourself from them. You can't sell them, as it were. And so this has become an issue, for instance, in legal proceedings around civil divorce, where one person earns a degree that's inalienable. How does that get factored in the distribution of one's collected property moving into, the dissolution of that marriage contract, right? And so that's been weighed. That's important. various critical race theory scholars, legal scholars in particular, have argued that this notion of disposition or inalienability as a stumbling block for considering whiteness, or this, as Isabel Wilkerson would say, the kind of dominant caste association as a property is problematic, and we need to, let go of that, because there are these other instances where inalienability is already factored in. Right to use and engagement. Our institutional legal system has enshrined white privilege as something whites can use and enjoy. That, I think, is the most intuitive thing for most of us to recognize. Reputation and status property. Again, I refer back to Plessy versus Ferguson as a great illustration of this. In a sense, what was being jealously guarded, as Cheryl Harris said, was the fact was who has the right to claim whiteness as an identity marker. And because Plessy had some percentage of his racialized identity as, quote, not white, he did not therefore have the legal ability, legal status to claim that identity. So whiteness then becomes something that is that is enjoyed, that convokes a certain amount of status in our context. I realize I'm running out of time, but just as an aside, it's interesting too how there's an inequality and an imbalance in the way that racialized identities are valued in the legal system up through actually the late 1950s. Defamation law in the United States illustrates this in a very disturbing way, which is if I were identified as white as I am, and somebody were to accuse me in being in a social location like Plessy as being somehow not white in some percentage or in total, I could sue that person for defamation. But if somebody who is identified as Black is called white, they don't have that same legal recourse. And part of that has to do with the value that's applied to, what whiteness means in a systemically racist context. So that's just a very interesting thing. The case law is fascinating around that. The last point is this absolute right to exclude. And I think this is really at the heart. Again, Plessy is a great example of this. Whiteness, though, is characterized by and large as those who are identified as not something else. And I think this is part of the problem, obviously, with whiteness as a normative and default cultural, racial marker, identity characteristic in a white supremacist context like the United States. That white folks are not Black, not Latinx, not of Asian descent, and so forth. And that's really important to recognize that it is an exclusive marker rather than an identity that's determined by some unifying characteristic, as Harris says. If I had more time, I would talk a bit more about my own personal experience of where I see this most clearly has been as a distance runner. That's kind of my primary hobby, and how I've traveled the world and have run in all kinds of places. And this came to the fore for me when thinking 2 years ago, or just a little bit more than 2 years ago now at this point, about the death of Mr. Ahmaud Arbery, and how a 25-year-old Black man going out for a run is something that I could relate to personally. And what was the difference between his experience and mine? What wasn't he allowed the right to? What kind of access wasn't he granted by virtue of his racial identity? Again, this notion of whiteness as a property that is inalienable, it's non-transferable, it's something that's identified with me and I carry with me everywhere, that I am not exposed to the same threat, danger, or discrimination, violence, or subjugation as others by virtue of this property that is whiteness. And it has, of course, as I've been highlighting, from Harris's work and others, legal ramifications in a concrete sense. And I think, we see this illustrated again. Probably one of the most famous ways this gets illustrated is in Professor Peggy McIntosh's famous essay, Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack, popularizing the notion of white privilege. There are some examples of her many that are posted here, and we could add so many others. And I think that this is, a very concrete illustration of how whiteness functions as a property that has value, that is exclusive, and it has real legal consequences. So I'll stop there and look forward to our conversation and pass it over now to Dr. Kelly Faust.
Good evening. I'm going to share my screen. I just want to thank you all for coming tonight and thank my co-presenters. So the component that I'm talking to you about tonight of critical race theory is interest convergence. You can see that there are 5 here. We're covering 3 sort of in detail tonight. So interest convergence, in terms of a definition, is essentially where the interests of Blacks with regards to racial equality will only be accommodated when they converge with the interest of whites. Derek Bell is one of the people who's written the most about interest convergence, and he primarily refers to Brown versus the Board of Education as an example of interest convergence. Specifically, he argued that policymakers didn't move to enact desegregation until it was in the interests of white America. How do we look at this? In other words, how did desegregation align with the interest of whites? A few points to look at here. First, with regards to this question of all men are created equal, desegregation allowed the United States to increase our prestige and credibility amid the struggle against communism. By ending the hypocrisy of separate but equal, the US could make a better case for its pursuit of democracy abroad. Additionally, desegregation increased the troop morale of Black soldiers who had fought for equality and freedom for those in other countries and returned to find that things still weren't equal here at home. Desegregation also allowed for economic growth in the South as corporations and potential investors were turned off by the separate but equal doctrine. And this was a way for the white people with money and power to kind of increase the likelihood of investors and profit off of labor instead of and to profit off of labor. So one thing that's important to note here is that not only did whites benefit the most from some of these outcomes, but Blacks also experienced hardships due to desegregation. And that's a common thing that you'll notice with some of these examples. Owners of Black businesses went out of business when other businesses were desegregated. Teachers at Black schools lost their jobs, and Black students lost the ability to learn from somebody who looked like them. Additionally, later policies were passed that weakened the Brown versus Board of Education decision. And even to this day, we see examples of educational inequality. We can look at some other examples of interest convergence. One author, Jackson, 2011, argues that Obama's election to office could be seen as an example of interest convergence. Obama's election is widely cited among some as evidence that America is a post-racial society, reasoning that since a Black man has held the highest office in the country, we're no longer racist. Jackson instead suggests that many whites were inclined to vote for Obama to pacify racial guilt, and that his success contributes to the illusion of a colorblind society, which in turn makes whites feel better about racism. Jackson points out that this advance, like many others, has failed to truly benefit Black Americans, as they are still, before and after Obama's time in office, more likely to experience infant mortality, be imprisoned, die by homicide, and lack health insurance, just to name a few. One other example of interest convergence, Hogg 2021, suggests that the protests during the summer of 2020 and any resulting changes or reforms are another example of interest convergence. Many Black people had been killed by police prior to George Floyd, but this was a tipping point. This was a point where Hogue argues it finally became popular, or at least socially acceptable, to embrace Black Lives Matter, support defunding the police or other types of reform, or even just recognizing racial inequalities in the criminal justice system. We saw in the immediate months after George Floyd that even corporations were issuing anti-racist statements and things. We can only assume that corporations doing something like this were doing so to profit on the wokeness of white people at this point in time. So one thing that's important to note here is that with any of the changes that have come from the summer of 2020, the legal and social status of Blacks hasn't changed. Also, another point that I wanted to make here is that numerically speaking, more white people are killed and assaulted by police than Black people. So any actual reduction in police violence is a direct benefit to whites. More, if we want to think about it that way. So these are just some examples of interest convergence that I wanted to kind of bring to light and use to make this this concept a little bit more accessible. And that's all I have for us. Thanks.
Well, thank you, all three of you. Participants, the chat is open. So if you have questions for any of our panelists, go ahead and type them into the chat and I will moderate the Q&A. Okay, so Susan has chimed in here. She says, in comm, we always talk about starting a difficult conversation with finding common ground. I agree that racism is who we are, but has it gotten any less who we are in the last 50 years? Is there a way to find legitimate common ground in light of the many injuries against people of color?
I guess I'll start with that, and I'll try to be as diplomatic as I can. The answer to your question is it depends who you ask. If on the one hand, yes, I can now sit in theory on any part of the bus that I like. I have educational privileges and access to things that my great-grandmother could not have imagined. But as Dr. King said after the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, you enter the hearts and minds stage. And so the reason I'm reluctant to say, oh, well, it's getting better is because you have to define better. If we're talking legally, perhaps, but then even the Voting Rights Act is now being curtailed, right? And so every advance that's made has to be reinforced by the next generation and the next generation and the next generation. And so the reason I don't like using less, that type of less language, is because it suggests that you don't have to keep hustling, and you always have to keep hustling. The backlash to the Civil War was the Klan, right? The backlash to Reconstruction was effectively the reason that my family ended up going into South Bend, Indiana, because my grandfather was a World War I vet. He came back home just in time for lynching season in Mississippi. So I'm very reluctant to say it's less who we are. I'm not convinced of that. I think racism shifts and it mutates. And if you don't look for the mutation, then you can get suckered into thinking that there is some sort of common ground. The common grounds you have to keep fighting, because any rights you have can be taken away by the people who come after you. That is simply the reality of having to fight to be considered human.
Can I piggyback on that? I'm going to quote somebody that people might not expect in this topic, which is the Bishop of Rome, Pope Francis, who maybe unexpectedly used the COVID-19 pandemic as an analog for the persistence of racism, to Dr. Davis's point. And he said, what you just said right now, Stacey, just triggered this for me, which is that it is a virus that hides and lurks and comes back up in all kinds of different forms. And it's amazing in terms of world leaders. I think he's one of the few people, certainly one of the few white world leaders who really gets it. And I just want to kind of tie what Dr. Davis said to the notion of whiteness as property, because, why haven't things gotten better? Why does racism persist? Because racism is a white problem. As Father Brian Massengale of Fordham University said in an interview a year and a half ago, if racism were a problem that people of color could do something about, it would have been solved 400 years ago. And so, and I think, both the interest convergence point that Dr. Faust is talking about and whiteness as property as a jealously guarded principle is really key. And I'll just add one more thing, and that is, it's important to think about not just whiteness as a non-material or immaterial real property, but what is gained and lost when people who have not been afforded the privileges and benefits of whiteness start to get some of those things that have been excluded only for whites. Then there's all sorts of other things that get triggered. So, maybe white folks don't have to sacrifice a lot in terms of finance. Like, you're not going to lose your job because, Black people have the benefits of affirmative action, which is another context Cheryl Harris is talking about in her work. But, the example that often comes to mind for me, and that critical race theorists have highlighted, especially, Black scholars have pointed out, is that for the poorest, most otherwise disadvantaged white person in the deep heart of Appalachia or on the streets of South Bend, the one kind of thing that they still have in a deeply racist and white supremacist society is, well, at least I'm not X, I'm not Black, I'm not Latinx, etc. And so there's that sort of thing that goes and continues, and I think lurks, as Pope Francis says, as a virus in an ongoing pandemic of racism, just to build on what Dr. Davis said.
All right, Jamie has added a question. She wants to know, what are your thoughts on how critical race theory has been framed in both politics and the media this past year? She also, before you answer, said, "You are all great," and wants to thank you for doing this.
Who wants to go first?
I'll just say briefly that as a historian, it saddens me, because from what I can see, the way critical race theory is being described is that somehow it's an attack on the United States, as if the United States is a static object. And that's not the case. When Kelly, when you were talking about sort of the costs of desegregation, right? That one of the things that can happen in a less integrated environment is that you can learn about the parts of history that aren't taught in other places. My parents had to supplement a lot of my history classes with other stuff, because otherwise I wouldn't have learned about Reconstruction or the Great Migration or the fact that slavery wasn't a good thing, even though it made Black people Christian. So what critical race theory is trying to say is, it's not that they want to make anybody feel bad, but these movements to say, we cannot talk about anything that could make people uncomfortable. Almost all of history is going to make you uncomfortable at some point. I still can't go to the Slavery Museum without freaking out. There's a sense in which we're not necessarily, education is not necessarily designed to make you comfortable. or to reaffirm your worldview. I had to learn that Black people sold other Black people into slavery. That's how this worked. The point is to say that we can all do bad things. It's this idea that we can't be critical of our own country that is incredibly disappointing.
I would agree. I think that the idea that we're not allowed to make someone feel bad, right? That all of this is about feeling, when really that should be the last thing on our mind. I think it's, we should be able to critically look at the United States. It's not a static object. It's not something that, remains unchanged. It's, yeah. I think it's very sad and unfortunate, because I think, well, I know I was teaching critical race theory for a long time before this happened. And now all of a sudden I've got students that are more resistant to it than in the past. So it's, it's really unfortunate.
It is too. And it's so deliberate, I can't remember the name of the kind of alt-right activist who picked on this and said, we're gonna make this the new thing. But picking up, Kelly, on your point, which is like, those of us who've been doing this work for a while, even outside of law school, this is, it just struck me as so absurd and out of the blue, because what's being described in the media and by certain politicians is not critical race theory. It's not anything. It's this straw man, boogeyman nonsense. And, I keep thinking of two things. One is, it would be funny if it wasn't so dangerous and absurd, the violence, verbal, emotional, psychological, even physical violence that has arisen. You look at those videos of the school board hearings in districts all over this country, and the anger and the fear and the white rage that you see among certain parents and community members. No 5-year-old is studying critical race theory unless they have, unless they're little legal geniuses reading the Harvard Law Review. I just is so insane, the premise. But I think at the end of the day, it's another form of trying to distract folks and to delegitimize history and real honest thinking. So it's deeply, deeply upsetting. I'd love to meet a little Doogie Howser of law, who's a critical race theorist in first grade. And let's give them a scholarship to to St. Mary's.
I think it'd make a great television show. I'd watch it. Young Sheldon, but in with critical race theory.
Coming this fall to Court TV, Annie Smith, the critical race theorist 5-year-old.
We have some thanks coming into the chat. Jess said that she apologizes for having to leave early, but she said the presentations were really interesting and informative, and thank you very much. And Susan also says thank you for your response to her questions.
Can panelists ask each other questions? Can we in the time?
Sure.
This is for Kelly. I mean, I'm fascinated, even more so than whiteness as property, about interest convergence theory, and I've done a little bit of work on that. And one of the things that your examples are so good, but one that has always kind of really struck me that seems very apt right now is the Cold War propaganda, and how the Soviet Union used our Jim Crow laws and legal segregation as a kind of jujitsu tool against American claims to democracy. And it's so fresh in my mind now as we hear of the tragedy in Ukraine, and the propaganda that Vladimir Putin has used to say, for instance, and here's the thing, they're not wrong when they say, for instance, you want to be part of the West with the United States who invaded Iraq. How is this any different? There's no legal pretense for that. To me, it just echoes again of, a mirror being held up to us, but then being used again for terrible, terrible designs. I don't know if you have any thoughts about like how the Cold War in the 50s led to things like Brown versus Board of Education, and like, are there echoes today as a criminologist and a scholar of this?
Absolutely. I think, oh goodness, I think the criminal justice system is full of examples of interest convergence. When I was thinking earlier too, in terms of examples, just the abolishment of slavery can be an example of this. Really, again, it was this question of how can you be a great nation if this is what you allow, and so definitely that. But again, in terms of undermining any sort of actual progress, there's the loophole in the 13th Amendment that you can still be enslaved if it's for punishment of a crime. So it's this making progress because it seems as though it's in everyone's interests, even though it maybe slightly more benefits whites, but making this progress and then realizing later that not as much progress was made as we thought there was. Yeah, I think I got off topic with what you were saying, but I think propaganda, yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, I remember in the summer of 2020 that there were some, of all things, terrorist groups that were using the incident with George Floyd as a recruiting tool and saying that this is an example of, see, can't trust those Americans. The West is not good. They will kill their own people, right? And so this is why they are not reliable. And I think Chinese state media did a similar thing when we were complaining about human rights abuses against the Uyghurs, right? Who are we to talk because we do X?
Yeah.
If other folks have questions, you can add them to the chat.
I'll just add something in the silence. I'm the first one to crack. One thing I didn't get a chance to talk much about in my presentation is how, for those who aren't familiar with Harris's, again, now classic article, it's not a short article, but it's well worth reading, and you don't have to be, you don't have to have a JD to read it. So I encourage folks to pick it up. But she begins with a very personal reflection on her grandmother, who in many ways occupied a social location not unlike Plessy, which is as a woman who passed for white in Chicago and was able to gain employment that would have been restricted by virtue of this principle of whiteness as property to those identified as white women in the early 20th century. And it's striking to hear how that leads to thinking about reality in a broader perspective. And I think, that's why I just mentioned in passing my own experience of reflection. It's one thing to know things sort of intellectually and abstractly and theoretically, but then to think about it yourself. And, as a white cisgendered man in the United States, to think about the intersection of privilege, not in the abstract, that I understand, but to think about how it's embodied in me is really key. And I think that's something I would encourage all of us to do. I know, Stacy just did in her own sharing about her own experience, family history, and her own personal experience as well. But I don't think white folks like myself do that very often. And, in a predominantly white context like St. Mary's, this is an opportunity for us in our respective disciplines to invite our students to think critically about this too. Especially when they're getting messages, as we've already discussed, in the broader society and in the media, that you shouldn't have to think about this. I mean, that is a benefit of whiteness as a property and white privilege. So it's a little, I'll hop off my soapbox now.
All right. Oh, we do have something coming in the chat. Yay. All right. Ella says, thank you to all of the panelists. Very good information and food for thought. I have a swirling of ideas that I need to organize in some way before formulating questions and conversations. Are there any plans for some kind of ongoing discussion groups in the future? So I think as the FAIR representative here, that might be my question to answer. So this was an event that was put together really by Regina Hill. And it was going to be a 7-week series where each week the group would be exploring one of the central tenets of critical race theory. With all of the other things kind of going on this spring, it got condensed down into this single event. We don't have distinct plans at this point for additional events. However, if you have ideas, come talk to your FAIR representative or to someone in the Division of Equity and Inclusion. I'm sure that is something that we would be willing to entertain and try to make happen. This is an important conversation that needs to be an ongoing conversation. So. Yes, thank you. And Jamie chimed in, FAIR will continue talks next year focusing on visibility and intersectionality. So we've had this 3-year series where we talked about pedagogy. This year we've been focusing on language. Next year we'll be looking at visibility and representation. So we'll be taking that angle as well.
Can I make a pitch for an event forthcoming from the Center for Spirituality? I'll put that hat on for a moment. We had a new series that began this year, this semester, and it's going to continue indefinitely every semester, called the Ex Libris Author Series. And the third of our 3 presenters this semester are the co-authors of Ben in the Struggle, Pursuing an Anti-Racist Spirituality. And so that's April 27th. And I think it's going to be a really, really exciting and engaging opportunity to think through some of these things through another lens as well, the lens of spirituality and the whole person. So couldn't resist. I had to advertise that. Thank you.
Thank you. And someone's also asked if this event this evening was part of the Language Matters series. Not exactly. So this was a separate event that Regina was organizing, and it's been co-sponsored by FAIR because it does sort of mesh with some of the things that we were talking about as part of our 3-year program. So it's not a distinct part of the Language Matters series, but it's connected. Well, with that, folks, I've got 7:30 on my clock, so I will let you all go and get back to your evenings. Thank you again to our panelists who all done a wonderful job. We appreciate your time tonight.
Thanks, everyone.